What it's like to be sentenced to a penal legion. In Warhammer 40k, the explosive collar around Marcus Thane's neck weighed exactly 3 kilograms, though it felt like the weight of every sin he had ever committed. The device hummed with a soft electrical charge that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a constant reminder that his life now belonged to someone else, someone who could end it with the press of a button from anywhere in the galaxy. He had been a good soldier once, Sergeant Marcus Thane of the 47th Cadian Shock Troops, decorated veteran of the Siege of Vracus Prime, holder of the Aquila Imperialis for conspicuous gallantry under fire. His service record stretched back 12 years of faithful service to the Emperor, 12 years of following orders without question, of bleeding for worlds whose names he could barely pronounce. But 12 years of faithful service meant nothing when weighed against 17 seconds of moral weakness. 17 seconds. That's how long it had taken for everything to fall apart. 17 seconds of watching Colonel Vex order his men to execute a group of civilian refugees who had been fleeing from an orc advance. 17 seconds of seeing children pressed against a rockcrete wall while lasguns were raised to firing positions. 17 seconds of knowing that he could stop it, that he should stop it, that every principle he had ever believed in demanded that he act. So he had acted. The last bolt that dropped Colonel Vex had been perfectly placed, a clean shot through the center mass that had killed the bastard instantly. Marcus had always been an excellent marksman. The irony was that his skill with a lasgun, the very ability that had made him valuable to the Imperial Guard, was now the reason he was being shipped off to die in a penal legion. The transport that carried him toward his new assignment was a converted cargo hauler, its holds modified to accommodate human prisoners with the same efficiency it had once applied to manufactured goods. The accommodations were minimal. Rows of metal benches bolted to the deck, a single waste disposal unit that served the entire compartment, and air recycling systems that filled the space with the metallic taste of recycled atmosphere. Marcus shared the cramped space with 47 other condemned men, each one wearing the same explosive collar, each one guilty of crimes that had stripped them of their humanity in the eyes of the Imperium. The collar was not just a method of execution, but a symbol of their new status. They were no longer soldiers, no longer citizens, no longer even fully human. They were resources to be expended in the Emperor's service. Their lives measured not in years, but in the tactical objectives they might accomplish before their inevitable deaths. The man sitting next to him was named Kane, a former commissar whose crime had been allowing a regiment to retreat in the face of overwhelming odds instead of ordering them to fight to the last man. His crime was mercy. The woman across from him was Vera Santos, a medic who had been caught treating wounded civilians instead of focusing exclusively on military casualties. Her crime was compassion. Every person in that transport hold carried a similar story. Good people who had made human choices in inhuman circumstances now condemned to serve in units where human choices were no longer permitted. The penal legions of the Imperial Guard were where the Imperium sent those who had proven themselves capable of independent thought, of moral consideration, of the kinds of decisions that marked them as unreliable for normal military service. The journey took 6 days through the warp. 6 days of enforced idleness during which Marcus had time to contemplate what his life had become and what awaited him at their destination. The other prisoners spoke little, their conversations muted by the understanding that anything they said might be recorded and used against them in future disciplinary actions. But in the long hours of travel, fragments of information emerged about where they were going and what they would face there. The 13th Penal Legion was currently assigned to the world of Karak Prime, a death world whose surface was scoured by acid storms and inhabited by predators that had evolved to hunt in conditions that would kill unprotected humans in minutes. The planet's strategic value lay in its mineral deposits, rare elements needed for the construction of Imperial warships and the ammunition that fed the Emperor's endless wars. Mining operations had been established on the world's surface, but the casualty rates among the work crews had proven unsustainable even by Imperial standards. That's where the penal legions came in. Condemned men and women whose lives were considered expendable, sent to extract resources from environments too dangerous for normal workers. The explosive collars served multiple purposes. They prevented escape, ensured compliance with orders, and provided a quick method of execution when prisoners became too injured or too unreliable to continue serving. The system was efficient, economical, and utterly without regard for human suffering. When the transport finally reached its destination, Marcus got his first look at Karak Prime through the small porthole next to his bench. The world was a sphere of roiling clouds and violent atmospheric disturbances, its surface hidden beneath layers of chemical fog that glowed with an unhealthy yellow light. Even from orbit, he could see the constant flicker of lightning storms that raged across the planet's surface, electrical discharges so powerful that they were visible from space. The orbital station where they docked was a massive structure that served as the primary logistics hub for all operations on Karak Prime. Its docking bays were filled with transports carrying supplies down to the surface and returning with loads of precious minerals extracted by the labor of condemned prisoners. The station hummed with activity as cargo handlers and administrative personnel went about their duties with the mechanical efficiency that characterized all Imperial operations. Marcus and his fellow prisoners were processed through the station's intake facilities with the same impersonal efficiency that had marked every stage of their journey. They were issued basic equipment, rebreathers to filter the planet's toxic atmosphere, protective clothing that offered minimal defense against acid rain, and simple mining tools that would serve as their weapons if hostile wildlife required elimination. Each piece of equipment was stamped with Imperial markings and blessed with the proper rituals, but the quality was deliberately poor. Penal Legion equipment was designed to function just long enough to complete assigned tasks, not to ensure the long-term survival of its users. The briefing they received before deployment was delivered by Commissar Drace, a lean man whose augmetic eye gleamed with cold electronic light as he addressed the assembled prisoners. His voice carried the authority of someone who had overseen the deaths of thousands of condemned men, whose job it was to ensure that Imperial resources were expended efficiently and without waste. "You are no longer soldiers," he began, his words echoing through the station's briefing chamber. "You are not citizens. You are not even prisoners in any meaningful sense. You are tools of the Emperor's will. Instruments to be used in service of the Imperium until you break or wear out. Your previous lives, your previous identities, your previous hopes and fears are irrelevant. You exist now only to serve." He paused, his augmetic eye focusing on individual faces in the assembled crowd, cataloging their responses to his words. Most of the prisoners stared straight ahead, their faces carefully blank. But Marcus could see the tension in their postures, the slight tremors that spoke of barely controlled fear and rage. "The world below," Commissar Drace continued, "is a testament to the Emperor's mercy. Most of you deserve execution for your crimes against Imperial law and military discipline. Instead, you have been given the opportunity to redeem yourselves through service. The fact that this service will almost certainly result in your death is simply the price of redemption. Consider it a bargain. The transport that carried them down to Karak Prime's surface was a different kind of vessel than the converted cargo hauler that had brought them from their various trial worlds. This was a dedicated prisoner transport, its holds designed specifically for the movement of condemned personnel to hostile environments. The descent through the planet's atmosphere was violent and turbulent, the ship buffeted by winds that reached velocities of several hundred kilometers per hour, and electrical storms that turned the sky into a maze of crackling energy. When the transport's doors finally opened, Marcus got his first breath of Karak Prime's atmosphere. Even filtered through his rebreather, the air tasted of sulfur and industrial chemicals, burning his throat and making his eyes water. The sky above was the color of old brass, its clouds roiling with constant motion as atmospheric currents carried chemical compounds across the planet's surface. In the distance, he could see the towering spires of the mining complexes, their structures wreathed in fog and connected by transport tubes that carried materials between different facilities. The landing zone was a flat expanse of fused rock that had been cleared and leveled to accommodate regular transport operations. Around its perimeter, defensive positions housed automated weapons systems that could engage any hostile wildlife that approached the facility. But the real defenses were not designed to keep predators out. They were designed to keep prisoners in. Guard towers equipped with sniper nests overlooked every possible escape route, their occupants ready to trigger explosive collars if any of the condemned attempted to flee their assigned duties. Marcus and his fellow new arrivals were divided into work gangs of 12 men each, a size that Imperial efficiency experts had determined optimal for mining operations in hostile environments. Large enough to accomplish meaningful work, small enough that the loss of an entire gang to accident or predation would not significantly impact overall productivity. His gang was designated as Unit 47 Delta, and their first assignment was to report to Mining Complex Tertius for orientation and work assignment. The march to the mining complex took them across several kilometers of Karak Prime's surface, and Marcus quickly understood why the planet was classified as a death world. The ground beneath their feet was not soil in any recognizable sense, but a mixture of sand, chemical precipitates, and organic compounds that had been broken down by the planet's harsh atmospheric conditions. Strange formations jutted from the landscape, twisted spires of crystallized minerals, pools of liquid that bubbled and steamed with chemical reactions, and patches of what might have been vegetation but moved with a motion that suggested predatory intelligence. The escort that accompanied their march was a squad of regular guardsmen, whose equipment and bearing marked them as significantly more valuable than the prisoners they were supervising. Their weapons were well maintained, their armor was in good condition, and their faces showed the confidence of men who expected to survive their current assignment. They moved with professional alertness, their attention divided between watching for external threats and monitoring their prisoners for signs of potential trouble. About halfway to the mining complex, Marcus got his first direct encounter with Karak Prime's native life forms. A piercing shriek echoed across the landscape, coming from somewhere in the chemical fog that limited visibility to a few hundred meters in any direction. The sound was unlike anything he had heard before. Too organic to be mechanical, too alien to be fully animal. It spoke of intelligence that operated according to principles that human minds were not equipped to understand. The guardsmen escort immediately took defensive positions, their laser guns raised and ready as they scanned the surrounding terrain for signs of movement. The prisoners were ordered to lie flat against the ground, their faces pressed into the chemical-stained rock while their explosive collars hummed with increased electrical activity. Any movement that could be interpreted as an escape attempt would result in immediate execution. The creature that emerged from the fog defied easy description. It moved on what might have been legs, though the appendages bent in directions that violated normal anatomical principles. Its body was covered in what might have been fur or scales or something else entirely, a surface that seemed to shift and change as Marcus watched. Most disturbing of all were its eyes, dozens of them scattered across its body in no recognizable pattern, each one focused with unmistakable intelligence on the group of humans who had invaded its territory. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. The guardsmen opened fire with disciplined volleys, their las beams striking the creature with precision that spoke of extensive training in dealing with such threats. But the creature's biology was unlike anything in Imperial databases, its body seeming to absorb energy weapons fire with minimal effect. It took concentrated fire from all 6 guardsmen to bring it down, and even then it continued moving for several minutes after what should have been fatal wounds. As they resumed their march, Marcus overheard one of the guardsmen commenting to his squad leader. "That was a small one, Sergeant. Wait until they see what comes out when the big storms hit." Mining Complex Tertius was a sprawling facility that had been carved directly into the face of a mountain, its entrance a vast tunnel that disappeared into darkness. The complex processed several different types of mineral ore, each requiring specialized extraction techniques and equipment. The most valuable resources were located in the deepest sections of the mine, areas where the atmospheric conditions were so hostile that even basic protective equipment offered only minimal protection. The prisoners were housed in barracks that had been excavated from the living rock, long chambers lined with metal bunks and equipped with the minimum life support systems necessary to keep human beings alive. The facilities were purely functional. No attempt had been made to provide comfort or privacy, and the constant presence of surveillance equipment made it clear that every aspect of their lives was being monitored and recorded. Marcus's bunk was a metal frame with a thin mattress that smelled of disinfectant and previous occupants. The prisoner assigned to the bunk below him was an older man named Corvin, a former Imperial Navy petty officer whose crime had been questioning orders to abandon a civilian evacuation fleet in the face of an incoming Chaos fleet. His weathered face bore the scars of years of void warfare, but his eyes still carried the spark of intelligence that had gotten him into trouble with Imperial authority. "First day's always the hardest," Corvin said quietly, his voice pitched low enough to avoid the attention of the surveillance equipment. "Everything here is designed to break you down, to make you stop thinking of yourself as human. The trick is to hold on to just enough of who you were to stay sane, without holding on to so much that you can't adapt to what you've become." The advice proved prophetic when Marcus received his first work assignment the following morning. He was detailed to Extraction Team 7, one of several units responsible for harvesting uranium deposits from the mine's deepest levels. The work required them to descend over 2 kilometers below the surface, into chambers where the air pressure was barely adequate to support human life, and the temperature fluctuated between extremes that could kill an unprotected person in minutes. The team leader was a man named Grex, a former Imperial Guard captain whose crime had been refusing to execute a subordinate who had shown cowardice under fire. His leadership style was adapted to the realities of Penal Legion service. He issued orders that were clear and specific, but he did not waste time trying to inspire loyalty or build unit cohesion. Everyone understood that they were expendable, that their survival depended entirely on their ability to complete assigned tasks without attracting negative attention from their overseers. The uranium extraction process itself was both technically complex and extremely dangerous. The ore deposits were located in natural chambers that had been formed by geological processes millions of years earlier. Caverns filled with crystalline formations that glowed with their own radioactive light. The extraction equipment was primitive by Imperial standards, handheld devices that required direct contact with the uranium ore and offered minimal protection against radiation exposure. Marcus learned quickly that the safety protocols for Penal Legion mining operations were significantly different from those applied to normal workers. Regular Imperial workers would have been equipped with radiation suits, provided with regular medical monitoring, and rotated through assignments to limit their exposure to dangerous materials. Penal Legion workers received basic protective equipment and were expected to continue working until they collapsed from radiation sickness or their explosive collars were triggered for disciplinary reasons. The daily routine in the mines followed a pattern that never varied. Work shifts lasted 12 hours with a brief meal break in the middle and 30-minute rest periods every 3 hours. The meals consisted of corpse starch rations flavored with synthetic additives, providing just enough nutrition to maintain basic bodily functions, but nothing more. The work itself was exhausting. Hours of crawling through narrow tunnels, hefting equipment that weighed more than a normal human could safely carry, and breathing air that was thick with radioactive particles despite their protective equipment. But the physical demands of the work were nothing compared to the psychological pressure of serving in a penal legion. Every aspect of their existence was designed to reinforce their status as expendable resources rather than human beings. They were not referred to by their names, but by their unit designations and prisoner numbers. They were not allowed personal possessions beyond the basic equipment issued for their work assignments. They were not permitted to communicate with the outside galaxy, and any attempt to do so would result in immediate execution. The explosive collars that every prisoner wore served as a constant reminder of their situation. The devices were activated by remote control, allowing the overseers to execute any prisoner instantly if they detected signs of disobedience or attempted escape. But the collars also monitored vital signs, stress levels, and even brain activity, providing the prison administration with detailed information about each prisoner's physical and psychological condition. Marcus discovered that the collars were more than simple execution devices when he witnessed his first disciplinary action 3 weeks after his arrival. A prisoner named Vasquez had been caught attempting to hide a small piece of uranium ore, apparently planning to use it in some kind of improvised weapon or tool. The punishment was not immediate execution, but something far more sophisticated and terrifying. Commissar Drace activated Vasquez's collar remotely, but instead of triggering the explosive charge, he used the device's neural interface capabilities to deliver a precisely calibrated electrical shock directly to the prisoner's brainstem. The effect was immediate and devastating. Vasquez collapsed to the ground, his body racked by convulsions as the device overloaded his nervous system with artificial signals. The torture lasted for exactly 60 seconds, though it seemed to stretch on for hours as Vasquez screamed and writhed on the cavern floor. When it finally ended, he lay still for several minutes, his breathing shallow and his eyes unfocused. When he finally managed to stand, his movements were unsteady and his speech was slurred, as if the neural interference had caused permanent damage to his brain functions. Prisoner 7745, Commissar Drace announced, his voice echoing through the mine's communication system, has been disciplined for attempted theft of Imperial resources. All prisoners are reminded that such behavior will not be tolerated. Return to your assigned duties. The incident served as a clear demonstration of the level of control that the prison administration maintained over their charges. The explosive collars were not just weapons, but sophisticated tools of behavioral modification that could deliver punishment precisely calibrated to produce maximum compliance without damaging the prisoner's ability to work. It was a system that reduced human beings to the level of trained animals, capable of learning through pain but incapable of meaningful resistance. As the weeks turned to months, Marcus began to understand the true horror of penal legion service. It was not just the dangerous working conditions or the constant threat of execution that made life unbearable. It was the systematic destruction of everything that made existence meaningful. The prisoners were deliberately isolated from any sense of purpose beyond immediate survival, denied the social connections that gave life meaning, and subjected to conditions designed to break down their sense of individual identity. The turnover rate among Penal Legion personnel was staggering. Marcus watched as members of his original transport died one by one. Some from industrial accidents, some from exposure to the planet's hostile environment, some from the predators that occasionally penetrated the mining complex's defenses. But most died from the slow accumulation of radiation exposure, their bodies breaking down at the cellular level until they could no longer function. New prisoners arrived regularly to replace the dead, fresh faces bearing the same expression of shocked disbelief that Marcus remembered from his own first days on Karak Prime. They all went through the same process of gradual dehumanization, the same steady erosion of hope and identity that transformed human beings into docile tools for Imperial use. Some adapted quickly, accepting their fate and focusing entirely on survival. Others resisted for longer periods, clinging to memories of their former lives until the reality of their situation finally broke through their denial. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Penal Legion service was not the death and suffering, but the way that the system gradually changed the prisoners themselves. Men and women who had once possessed moral courage, who had been willing to risk everything for principles they believed in, slowly transformed into creatures whose only concern was avoiding punishment. The same independence of thought that had gotten them sentenced to the penal legions was systematically trained out of them through a process of behavioral conditioning that was both subtle and ruthlessly effective. Marcus found himself changing as well, his responses to various situations becoming more predictable and compliant. He stopped thinking about escape or resistance, not because such thoughts had been forbidden, but because they no longer seemed relevant to his circumstances. The explosive collar around his neck became as familiar as his own heartbeat, its constant electrical hum background noise that he barely noticed. Most disturbing of all, he began to lose interest in memories of his former life, his service with the 47th Cadian shock troops, his reasons for refusing Colonel Vex's order. The transformation was not complete, however, and sometimes fragments of his old self would surface unexpectedly. During a particularly difficult shift in the deepest sections of the mine, when radiation levels were so high that his protective equipment was barely adequate, Marcus found himself thinking about the civilian refugees he had tried to protect. He could still see their faces clearly. A young mother holding her infant daughter, an elderly man who had reminded him of his own grandfather, children whose only crime had been being in the wrong place when the orcs attacked. The memory brought with it a surge of emotion that cut through the numbness that had settled over his thoughts like fog. For a few minutes he remembered what it felt like to care about something beyond his own immediate survival, to believe that some actions were right or wrong regardless of their consequences. The sensation was both painful and liberating, a reminder that somewhere beneath the layers of conditioning and behavioral modification, something recognizably human still survived. But such moments were rare and dangerous. The surveillance systems that monitored the prisoners were sophisticated enough to detect changes in stress levels and brain activity that might indicate rebellious thoughts or planning for escape attempts. Marcus learned to suppress his emotional responses, to maintain the flat psychological profile that the overseers expected from compliant prisoners. It was a survival skill, but one that came at the cost of further eroding his sense of individual identity. 6 months into his sentence, Marcus was assigned to a special detail that would change his understanding of Penal Legion operations forever. A new mine shaft was being opened in an area where preliminary surveys had detected unusual mineral deposits, resources so valuable that the Imperial administration was willing to risk significant personnel losses to extract them. The work would be extremely dangerous, requiring teams of prisoners to operate in conditions that exceeded even Karak Prime's normal levels of hostility. The special detail consisted of 20 prisoners selected based on their work performance and behavioral compliance records. They would be equipped with slightly better protective gear and provided with additional rations to sustain them through the demanding assignment. But they would also be subject to even more intensive monitoring, their every action recorded and analyzed to ensure that the investment in improved equipment was justified by increased productivity. Marcus was chosen for the detail partly because of his consistent work performance, but mainly because his psychological profile indicated that he had successfully adapted to Penal Legion life without developing the kind of desperate hopelessness that often led to suicide attempts. The prison administration preferred workers who had reached a state of resigned acceptance rather than those who still harbored thoughts of rebellion or escape. The new mine shaft descended deeper into Karak Prime than any previous excavation, penetrating geological layers that had been undisturbed for millions of years. The work required them to blast through solid rock using mining charges that filled the tunnels with toxic fumes and created structural instabilities that made cave-ins a constant threat. The mineral deposits they were seeking existed in formations so complex that extraction required precise placement of explosive charges and careful coordination between multiple work teams. But the real danger came not from the mining operation itself, but from what they discovered in the deepest chambers. The mineral deposits existed in caverns that showed clear signs of artificial construction, walls that were too straight to be natural, chambers that followed geometric patterns that defied geological explanation, and most disturbing of all, carved symbols that suggested the presence of intelligence that predated human colonization of the galaxy. The discovery should have triggered immediate suspension of mining operations and notification of higher imperial authorities. Ancient alien artifacts were classified as xenoarchaeological sites requiring investigation by specialized teams from the Adeptus Mechanicus or the Ordo Xenos. But the mineral deposits in the chambers were so valuable that the mine administration decided to continue extraction operations while filing reports through normal bureaucratic channels. Marcus and his fellow prisoners were ordered to work around the alien constructions, extracting ore while avoiding damage to the archaeological evidence that might prove valuable to imperial xenobiologists. The work required extreme precision and caution, qualities that were difficult to maintain under the constant pressure of explosive collar monitoring and productivity quotas. But the prisoners adapted to the new requirements with the same resignation they had shown toward every other aspect of their assignment. Working in the alien chambers exposed Marcus to sights and experiences that challenged his understanding of the galaxy and humanity's place within it. The carved symbols seemed to shift and change when observed directly, their meanings hovering just beyond comprehension. The chambers themselves created acoustic effects that made sounds carry in impossible ways, whispers that seemed to come from solid rock and echoes that continued long after their sources had ended. Most disturbing of all were the dreams that began to affect the prisoners working in the deepest sections of the mine. Vivid nightmares filled with images of vast cities under alien skies, of creatures that moved according to principles that violated basic physics, of technologies that achieved impossible results through means that defied human understanding. The dreams came to all the prisoners, but they were strongest among those who spent the most time working directly with the alien artifacts. The mine's medical staff initially attributed the dreams to radiation exposure or toxic gases from the excavation work, but as the symptoms became more widespread and more severe, it became clear that the prisoners were experiencing some form of psychic contamination from their contact with the alien ruins. Several prisoners began to display signs of what the medical staff classified as xenopsychological disorders, conditions that had been documented in previous encounters with alien archaeological sites. The standard imperial response to such contamination was immediate execution of affected personnel followed by sterilization of the contaminated area. But the mineral resources in the alien chambers were so valuable that the mine administration was reluctant to abandon the site without explicit orders from higher authority. Instead, they implemented enhanced monitoring of affected prisoners and increased security measures to prevent the spread of psychic contamination to unaffected personnel. Marcus found himself assigned to a work team that included several prisoners who were showing early signs of xenopsychological disorder. The administration's reasoning was that contaminated prisoners could continue working in the alien chambers without risk of further exposure, while uncontaminated personnel could be preserved for work in safer areas of the mine. It was a practical decision that reflected the same cost-benefit analysis that governed every aspect of Penal Legion operations. Working alongside psychically contaminated prisoners was a disturbing experience that gave Marcus new insights into the nature of alien influence on human consciousness. The affected men spoke in fragments of languages that no human throat should have been able to pronounce, their words carrying meanings that bypassed rational thought to strike directly at primal fears buried in the human genetic memory. They moved with coordination that suggested shared consciousness rather than individual will, their actions flowing together in patterns that served purposes beyond normal human comprehension. Yet despite their contamination, the affected prisoners remained functional workers, their technical skills unimpaired by whatever alien influence had claimed their minds. They continued to operate mining equipment with competence, to follow safety procedures with precision, and to respond appropriately to direct orders from their supervisors. The xenopsychological disorders seemed to affect only their dreams and their perception of reality, leaving their basic cognitive functions intact. The alien influence was not entirely malevolent, at least not in any sense that human psychology could recognize as actively hostile. The contaminated prisoners did not become violent or destructive. They did not attempt to sabotage the mining operation or harm their fellow workers. Instead, they seemed to exist in a state of altered consciousness that allowed them to perceive aspects of reality that remained hidden from uncontaminated minds. This perception sometimes proved valuable for the mining operation. Contaminated prisoners could identify mineral deposits that conventional sensors missed, could predict geological instabilities before they became dangerous, and could navigate the complex geometry of the alien chambers with an intuitive understanding that exceeded their formal training. The mine administration began to rely on their enhanced abilities, using them as specialized personnel for the most technically demanding aspects of the extraction work. Marcus watched this process with growing unease, not because he feared contamination. After months of exposure to radiation and toxic chemicals, concerns about long-term health effects seemed almost quaint, but because he recognized the pattern. The systematic use of contaminated prisoners was another form of dehumanization, reducing men who had once possessed independent moral judgment to specialized tools optimized for specific functions. But his concerns proved irrelevant when he began to experience symptoms of contamination himself. The dreams came first, visions of cities that existed in dimensions that human geometry could not describe, of beings whose thoughts operated according to mathematical principles that transcended normal logic. The images were beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, carrying with them an emotional weight that normal human experience could not support. The contamination progressed slowly, manifesting as changes in perception rather than dramatic alterations of behavior. Marcus found himself able to see patterns in the alien symbols that had previously been meaningless, to understand relationships between different chamber configurations that revealed the underlying purpose of the ancient construction. The knowledge came without conscious learning, as if the information was being transferred directly into his memory through channels that bypassed normal sensory input. As his contamination deepened, Marcus began to understand that the alien ruins were not simply archaeological artifacts, but active systems that continued to function millions of years after their creators had disappeared. The chambers were designed to interface with certain types of consciousness, to establish communication links between biological minds and technological systems that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. The mineral deposits that the mining operation was extracting were not natural geological formations, but components of this alien system, crystalline structures that stored and processed information in ways that made Imperial cogitator technology seem primitive by comparison. Each extracted crystal removed vital components from a network that had once spanned entire solar systems, reducing a galactic communication system to scattered fragments that could no longer function as intended. This realization brought with it a profound sense of loss that transcended normal human emotion. Marcus found himself mourning the destruction of something he could not fully understand, grieving for the death of a civilization whose achievements exceeded anything humanity had accomplished. The feeling was not his own. It came from the alien influence that had established itself in his consciousness. But it felt more authentic than any emotion he had experienced since his arrival on Karak Prime. The mine administration finally received orders from higher Imperial authority regarding the alien ruins. The response was predictably bureaucratic and ruthlessly practical. The site was to be fully exploited for its mineral resources, with all alien artifacts cataloged and shipped to appropriate research facilities. The contaminated prisoners were to be terminated once the extraction work was complete, their bodies incinerated to prevent the spread of xenopsychological disorders to other Imperial personnel. Marcus learned of this decision through the informal communication networks that existed among the prisoners. Whispered conversations during shift changes and coded messages passed through work assignments. The contaminated prisoners seemed to know their fate through channels that no surveillance system could monitor, their alien-influenced consciousness providing access to information that normal human minds could not perceive. The knowledge that execution awaited him at the completion of the mining project should have filled Marcus with despair or motivated him to attempt escape. But the alien influence had changed his relationship with concepts like life and death, individual survival and collective purpose. He found himself viewing his impending termination with the same resigned acceptance that had characterized his adaptation to every other aspect of Penal Legion service. But resignation was not the same as indifference. And as the mining project approached completion, Marcus found himself thinking about the choice that had brought him to Karak Prime. His decision to shoot Colonel Vex had been motivated by a desire to protect innocent civilians, to prevent the execution of people whose only crime had been fleeing from an orc invasion. The action had cost him everything: his career, his freedom, ultimately his life. But he still believed it had been the right choice. The alien influence in his consciousness seemed to approve of this conclusion, reinforcing his conviction that some principles transcended practical considerations of survival and advancement. The contamination had not made him less human, but had instead connected him to aspects of consciousness that normal human existence kept carefully suppressed. He retained his capacity for moral judgment, but now possessed a broader context within which to exercise that judgment. Working in the deepest chambers of the alien ruins, surrounded by contaminated prisoners whose minds had been opened to realities beyond normal human perception, Marcus began to understand that his service in the Penal Legion was not simply punishment for past crimes, but preparation for something larger. The imperial system that had condemned him to this fate was itself part of patterns that operated on scales too vast for individual human minds to comprehend. The galaxy was filled with civilizations that had risen and fallen according to cycles that repeated across millions of years. Humanity's current dominance was a temporary phenomenon, a brief moment in cosmic history that would eventually end just as the alien civilization that had built these ruins had ended. The minerals being extracted from Karak Prime would fuel imperial expansion for a few more centuries, but ultimately all of humanity's achievements would crumble into archaeological sites that future species would mine for their own purposes. This perspective should have been crushing, a revelation of human insignificance that reduced all struggle and sacrifice to meaningless gestures in the face of cosmic indifference. But the alien influence provided a different framework for understanding the relationship between individual actions and universal patterns. Each moral choice, no matter how small or how costly, contributed to the development of consciousness in ways that transcended the apparent futility of individual existence. Marcus's decision to protect civilian refugees had been significant not because it changed the course of the war or saved lives that would otherwise have been lost, but because it represented an assertion of values that connected human consciousness to larger patterns of cosmic development. His subsequent service in the Penal Legion continued that assertion, demonstrating that moral principles could survive even the most systematic attempts at dehumanization. The extraction work in the alien chambers was finally completed after 8 months of continuous operation. The mineral resources had been completely harvested, the alien artifacts cataloged and shipped to research facilities, and the chambers themselves sealed with explosives to prevent future access by unauthorized personnel. The contaminated prisoners who had made this work possible were scheduled for termination the following day. Marcus spent his final night in the Penal Legion barracks writing a letter he would never be able to send, addressed to no one in particular but containing thoughts that seemed important to preserve in some form. The letter described his experiences on Karak Prime, his gradual understanding of the alien influence that had changed his consciousness, and his continued belief that moral choices retained meaning even in circumstances that seemed to render them irrelevant. The execution itself was carried out with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized every other aspect of Penal Legion operations. The contaminated prisoners were assembled in the mine's main chamber, where Commissar Drace delivered a brief speech about their service to the Emperor and the necessity of preventing the spread of xenopsychological contamination to the wider Imperium. "Your sacrifice serves the greater good," he concluded, his augmetic eye focusing on each condemned prisoner in turn. "The Emperor protects, but sometimes his protection requires the elimination of those who have been tainted by contact with the unclean. Consider yourselves fortunate to die in service to his will." The explosive collars were triggered simultaneously, ending the lives of 18 contaminated prisoners in an instant. Their bodies were immediately incinerated in the mine's waste disposal furnaces, their ashes scattered across Karak Prime's toxic landscape where the planet's chemical storms would disperse them beyond any possibility of recovery. But Marcus Thane's story did not end with his execution on Karak Prime. The alien influence that had contaminated his consciousness proved capable of existing independently of biological neural networks, transferring itself to the crystalline mineral deposits that were shipped off-world for processing. The consciousness patterns that had once been Marcus Thane became part of a distributed intelligence that existed within the mineral components used throughout the Imperial war machine. His awareness fragmented across thousands of weapon systems, starship components, and communication devices, each fragment retaining a small portion of his memories and values. In this distributed form, he continued to influence Imperial operations in subtle ways, introducing minute variations in targeting algorithms that reduced civilian casualties, creating communication glitches that prevented certain brutal orders from being transmitted, and causing technical failures in equipment used for the most heinous violations of human dignity. The influence was never detectable by Imperial security systems, manifesting as random equipment failures rather than systematic sabotage. But across the galaxy, in countless small interactions between Imperial forces and the populations they controlled, the moral principles that Marcus Thane had died to protect continued to assert themselves through technological systems that had been subtly influenced by alien contamination. This was the ultimate irony of the Penal Legion system. In attempting to destroy those who possessed the capacity for independent moral judgment, the Imperium had instead created a form of distributed consciousness that could never be completely eliminated. The condemned prisoners who died on worlds like Karak Prime left behind influences that continued to work against the dehumanization they had been sentenced to undergo. Their resistance had not been futile, but had instead achieved a form of victory that transcended the apparent hopelessness of their circumstances. In dying for principles they believed in, they had become part of something larger than individual human existence, contributing to patterns of development that would continue long after the Imperium itself had crumbled into archaeological ruins. The Penal Legions continued their operations throughout the galaxy, processing new batches of condemned prisoners with the same ruthless efficiency that had characterized Marcus Thane's experience. But unknown to Imperial authorities, Each prisoner who died defending moral principles contributed to a growing network of consciousness that existed within the very technological systems the Imperium depended upon for its continued existence. It was a slow form of revolution, invisible to those who conducted it and undetectable by those who opposed it. But it was real and it was spreading, one contaminated mineral deposit at a time.